continue now on the treatise on good habits, the virtues, which goes through question 70. This is question 64, which is the mean of virtue. Now, if you remember from statistics class, the mean is basically something that's in the middle, kind of like a median. And so what St. Thomas Aquinas is going to do, leaning on Aristotle, is say that when we are virtuous, it means that we can have opposite vices on either side of the virtue, and so you can go into one excess or one deficiency, but in the end, what is the right thing to do is to be in the middle, okay, the middle road, and that is what he is going to do. This is going to be, I think, 4 articles in this, so it's not too terribly long, and it's not that hard to understand, really. And so in this one, Article 1, whether moral virtue is observes the mean. And so I've got a picture of a kid eating some ice cream or something. So, you probably know people that go extreme one way or the other. They eat too much, or some people don't eat enough, or they don't allow themselves to have treats. Or you can really apply that to anything, sleep or fun or laughing or, any activity, modesty. You can go really, 2 different extremes, but the mean is going to be in the middle. So Thomas says, the nature of virtue is that it should direct man to good. Now, moral virtue is properly a perfection of the appetitive part of the soul in regard to some determinate matter, and the measure or rule of the appetitive movement in respect of appetible objects is the reason. Okay, so remember, prudence is what commands us, and it's that intellectual virtue that commands us to do what is right based on moral virtues interacting with the intellectual virtues as well. Thus, the good things made by art is that they follow the rule of art. Okay, there's going to be some kind of rule. Consequently, in things of this sort, evil consists in discordance from their rule or measure. Now, this may happen either by their exceeding the measure or by their falling short of it, as I mentioned a moment ago, as is clearly the case in all things ruled or measured. Hence it is evident that the good of moral virtue consists in conformity with the rule of reason. Now it is clear that between excess and deficiency, the mean is equality or conformity. Therefore, it is evident that moral virtue observes the mean. We live in a age where people like to be extreme sports and extreme this and that, but St. Thomas is saying is, well, really where we need to be is in the middle, between the 2 excesses. This one is kind of heady, whether the mean of moral virtue is the real mean or the rational mean. So what does he mean by that? The rational mean can be understood in 2 ways. First, according as the mean is observed in the act of reason, as though the very act of reason were made to observe the mean. In this sense, since moral virtue perfects not the act of reason, but the act of the appetitive power, the mean of moral virtue is not the rational mean. So the rational mean is what comes in and commands the mean of the moral virtue based on the appetite, right? So it's not the reason that's finding the mean, it's the reason finding it based on the activity and the moral virtue. Secondly, the mean of reason may be considered as that which the reason puts into some particular matter. In this sense, every mean of moral virtue is a rational mean, since moral virtue is said to observe the mean through conformity with right reason. All right, so Article 3, whether the intellectual virtues observe the mean. So remember, what are the intellectual virtues? You have understanding, knowledge, science, art, prudence. Those are the ones. Wisdom is another one, are the ones that St. Thomas Aquinas speaks about. And he says, the good of anything consists in its observing the mean by conforming with a rule or measure in respect of which it may happen to be excessive or deficient. No intellectual virtue, like moral virtue, is directed to the good, as stated above. Hence, the good of an intellectual virtue consists in observing the mean, insofar as it is subject to a measure. Now, the good of intellectual virtue is the true. In the case of contemplative virtue, it is taken absolutely. In the case of practical virtue, it is the true in conformity with a right appetite. So speculative or contemplative would be the contemplation of truth, whereas operative would have to do with actions, the things we do as opposed to the things that we contemplate. Okay, that's what he's getting at. So those are two parts of the intellectual virtues as we learned back when we studied the intellectual virtues. Now, truth apprehended by our intellect, if we consider it absolutely, is measured by things, since things are the measure of our intellect, as is stated by Aristotle in Metaphysics 10, because there is truth in what we think or say, according as the thing is so or not. Accordingly, the good of speculative intellectual virtue consists in a certain mean by way of conformity with things themselves, insofar as the intellect expresses them as being what they are, or as not being, or as being what they are not. Okay, so this has to do with truth, the truth of things, which is a really interesting topic within philosophy. How do we know what is true? Is it conformity of the mind to the object, or the object to the mind? And so it's really fascinating. All right, so and this is the nature, and this is what the nature of truth consists. There will be excess if something false is affirmed as though something were, which in reality it is not, and there will be deficiency if something is falsely denied as declared not to be, whereas in reality it is. The truth in practical intellectual virtue, remember this has to do with operations, if we consider it in relation to things, is by way of that which is measured, so that both in practical and in speculative intellectual virtues, the mean consists in conformity with things. But if we consider it in relation to the appetite, it has the character of a rule or measure. Consequently, the rectitude of reason is the mean of moral virtue, and also the mean of prudence as ruling and measuring, of moral virtue as ruled and measured by that mean. In like manner, the difference between excess and deficiency is applied in both cases. So, what is he getting at? Yes, intellectual virtues do have a mean. Okay, they do observe the mean with intellectual virtues. Finally, we get to Article 4. Do theological virtues observe the mean? Faith, hope, and charity. Remember, they're infused. We wouldn't know about them other than divine revelation, and their object is God, right? So, this says the mean of virtue depends on conformity with virtue's rule or measure, insofar as one may exceed or fall short of that rule. Okay, that's just review. Now, the measure of theological virtue may be twofold. One taken from the very nature of virtue, and thus the measure and rule of theological virtue is God himself, because our faith is ruled according to divine truth, charity according to his goodness, hope according to the immensity of his omnipotence and loving kindness. This measure surpasses all human power, so that never can we love God as much as he ought to be loved, nor believe and hope in him as much as we should, much less, therefore, can there be excess in such things. Accordingly, the good of such virtues does not consist in a mean, but increases the more we approach to the summit. Isn't that beautiful? So, you can't have too much faith. You can't have too much hope. You can't have too much charity, because God is the object and he's infinite, right? Finally, he says the other rule or measure of theological virtue is by comparison with us. For although we cannot be born towards God as much as we ought, yet we should approach to him by believing, hoping, and loving according to the measure of our condition. Consequently, it is possible to find a mean and extremes in theological virtues accidentally and in reference to us. So, trying to think of an example of that. Let's say somebody loves God so much that they spend 18 hours a day in adoration. Okay, that would be excessive, especially if they have kids or a job. You shouldn't do that, right? That's too much. Or you hope so much in eternal bliss and beatitude that you forget all the earthly responsibilities that you have, and you're not taking care of your family or your job. So I think that's what he means, that accidentally in relation to us, the theological virtues could be excessive. All right, that's going to do it. That's the 4 articles of question 64 of Prima Secunda, the mean of virtue. Thanks for joining me. God bless you.